I am 103 years old today. The nurse taped a paper balloon to the wall this morning and wrote 103 in blue marker the way you would for a child who still believes numbers are magic. She meant well. They all do. But when you've lived this long, numbers stop being magic and start being weight. My hands shake as I write this, not from fear. Fear left me decades ago, but from the simple exhaustion of being a body that has stayed past its welcome. The pen feels heavier than it should. Everything does. I don't know who will read this. Maybe no one. Maybe someone long after my bones have turned back into the quiet minerals they once were. But I have learned something in 103 years, something that presses against my chest even now. Stories don't belong to the young. They belong to those who stayed, and I stayed. The beginning. Nobody remembers. I was born in 1923 in a house that doesn't exist anymore, on a road that has a different name now. My mother used to say I arrived quietly, as if I didn't want to bother anyone. That should have warned her. My earliest memory is not of faces, but of sound. The floorboards sang when you walked across them. Every step had its own note. I knew who was coming before I saw them. My father's steps were slow and careful, like he was apologizing to the floor for being heavy. My mother's were quick and sharp, always moving toward something unfinished. We were not poor in the way people mean today. We were poor in the way that meant you knew the exact weight of bread in your hand and the exact number of days it had to last. I learned early that silence could be full of waiting, full of listening, full of hope, pretending not to exist. The first, goodbye. My father died when I was 7, not suddenly, slowly. The kind of death that teaches a child patience in the worst possible way. I remember the room smelled like metal and boiled water. Adults spoke in half sentences, like the rest of the words might break something. I sat on the floor and counted the cracks in the wall, convinced that if I reached 100, he would wake up. I reached 103. He didn't wake up. That number followed me longer than I knew. After he was gone, my mother folded in on herself. Not dramatically, just smaller. Her laughter thinned, her shoulders bent. Love didn't disappear, but it became careful, like it was afraid to use up too much space. That's when I learned my second lesson. Love survives, but it changes shape. Becoming someone else. At 15 I left school. There was no ceremony, no argument. The world needed working hands more than it needed dreaming minds. I lied about my age and got a job cleaning machinery at a factory that hummed like an angry insect. The machines didn't care who you were. They respected attention and punished distraction. I liked that honesty. I watched older men lose fingers, younger boys lose hope. I learned how quickly a life could narrow down to a single bad second. At night, I dreamed of open fields I had never seen. During the day, I became someone reliable, dependable, invisible. That's how you survive long enough to matter. The war that took everyone. The war came like weather. Nobody voted on it. Nobody escaped it. I was drafted at 19. My mother cried without sound, the way people do when they don't want to admit they're afraid. She pressed my father's old watch into my hand. So you remember time still moves, she said. I went overseas and learned how loud the world could be. There is no sentence that can explain what war does to a person. It takes your future and replaces it with a series of moments you're desperate to survive. I watched friends become names carved into wood. I watched enemies bleed the same color as me. I watched myself become someone I never planned to be. But I also learned something there, something strange and permanent. Life does not ask if you are ready. The girl who changed everything. Her name was Eleanor. I met her in a train station months after the war ended. We were both holding paper cups of coffee that tasted like regret. She smiled at me like she already knew I was going to matter. We talked for 6 hours and missed our trains on purpose. Eleanor believed in things, not blindly, but fiercely. She believed in art and letters, and the idea that people were more than their worst days. She believed I was better than I thought I was. That kind of belief is dangerous. I married her within a year. I loved her for 46. A life made of ordinary days. People think long lives are made of big moments. They're wrong. They're made of ordinary days, stacked so carefully they become something solid. Breakfasts, arguments about money, late nights fixing broken sinks, hands brushing in the dark, children learning to walk, children learning to leave. We had 2 daughters. One inherited Eleanor's fire, the other inherited my silence. They both inherited our stubbornness. I worked, Eleanor painted. Sometimes we fought, often we laughed. Occasionally we were afraid. We were alive, and that was enough. Watching time take its share. A long life is a series of survivals you never asked for. My mother went first, then friends, then Eleanor. Cancer doesn't care how deeply you are loved, it just takes. I held her hand when the room grew quiet. I told her she had done enough. I told her I would remember her properly. After she was gone, the house echoed differently, not louder, emptier. Grief doesn't scream forever. Eventually it becomes a companion that sits beside you and says nothing. Becoming old age doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in. You stop driving at night. You forget names you know. Your body becomes a list of negotiations. But something else happens too. You stop pretending. I stopped worrying about being impressive. I stopped collecting things that needed dusting. I started saying exactly what I meant, because time was no longer something I could waste being polite. That honesty cost me some people. It also freed me. The world that outran me. I lived long enough to watch the world reinvent itself several times. Radios became televisions, televisions became phones, phones became everything. People started living online as if reality were optional. I didn't hate it, I just didn't belong to it. Every generation thinks the next one is lost. They're always wrong, they're just unfamiliar. The world doesn't decay, it transforms, and it doesn't ask permission. The last lessons. Now I sit in a quiet room with a window that faces east. I like watching the morning arrive. It feels polite, like the sun is checking in. At 103, I know this much. You will not do everything you plan to do. You will love imperfectly. You will hurt people without meaning to. You will survive things that feel unsurvivable. And one day you will realize that surviving was the point, not winning, not being remembered by strangers, just staying long enough to pass something human forward. If this is the last thing I write, let it be this. Say the thing. Take the hand. Forgive earlier. Don't wait for certainty. It never comes. Life is not short. It is fragile. And fragile things are precious because they end. I am 103 years old. I have loved. I have failed. I have stayed. And that, I think, is enough. There are things you don't say when you are young because you think there will be time later. Later becomes a habit, and habits are hard to break. I never told my mother that I understood her silence, that I knew she was tired, not cold. I never told her that the meals she stretched, the worries she swallowed, the nights she stayed awake, those things built me more than comfort ever could. By the time I understood that, she was already gone. I never told my daughters how often I watched them when they weren't looking, how proud I felt when they failed and stood back up on their own. Fathers think love is obvious. It isn't. Love needs words. Silence is not a substitute. It's a risk. I never told Eleanor how afraid I was of losing her, even when she was still alive. I thought fear would sound like weakness, so I hid it behind jokes, behind routines, behind the illusion that time was generous. It wasn't. If you live long enough, regret doesn't come from what you did wrong. It comes from what you left unsaid. I also learned that forgiveness is not an event. It's a decision you must remake again and again. I forgave people who never apologized. I forgave myself for being younger, dumber, slower to understand. Some days forgiveness felt noble. Other days it felt like work. Do not delay tenderness. Say it now. Hold longer. Call back. Write the letter, even if it's awkward. Time does not slow down out of respect for your plans. I am still here somehow at 103. Not because I did everything right, but because I learned slowly, painfully, honestly. And before the final page arrives, I want this truth to exist somewhere outside